Washington, D.C., 1942. In a red brick building just across the Potomac River, a secret war was being fought. Not with guns, not with bombs, but with pencils, paper, and brilliant minds. Inside Arlington Hall, hundreds of women sat at wooden desks, hunched over encrypted messages, working 16-hour shifts, 6 days a week. They weren't soldiers, they weren't spies. Most of them had never left their hometowns before, but they were about to change the course of World War II. This is the story you were never told. The story of the women who broke Japan's most secret codes, the women who helped win the Pacific War, and the women who were sworn to silence for over 50 years. This is the story of the codebreakers of Arlington Hall. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Over 2,400 Americans killed in a single morning. The United States was at war, and almost overnight, everything changed. Men enlisted by the millions, factories retooled to build tanks, planes and warships, and across the country, women stepped forward. They took jobs in factories, they became nurses, they drove ambulances, they built bombers. But some women were asked to do something different, something secret, something that required not strength, but intellect. In early 1942, the U.S. Army Signal Intelligence Service began recruiting a very specific type of person: women with degrees in mathematics, women who spoke foreign languages, women who were teachers, librarians, linguists, women who could think logically, solve puzzles, and keep secrets. The recruitment was quiet, no posters, no public announcements, just a letter in the mail, or a visit from a government official. The letter said something vague. Your country needs you for important war work. Report to Arlington Hall, Virginia. That was it. No details, no explanation, just an address and a date. And thousands of women said yes. They left their small towns, left their families, left their teaching jobs and university positions, and they came to Washington. Most of them had no idea what they were getting into. One woman, Anne Cara Christie, a school teacher from the Bronx, later recalled, "I thought I was going to be filing papers or typing. I had no idea I'd be breaking Japanese codes." Another, Genevieve Grotjan, a mathematician, said, "When they told me what the job was, I almost laughed. I thought, how on earth are we supposed to do that? But they did, and they were extraordinary." Arlington Hall had been a girls' school before the war, a sprawling campus with brick buildings, dormitories, and manicured lawns, but by 1942 it had been transformed. The classrooms were now filled with file cabinets. The gymnasium was converted into a code-breaking factory. Security fences went up. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. No one could enter without clearance. And inside, the women went to work. They were given stacks of intercepted Japanese messages, messages sent by radio, messages that had been plucked from the air by listening stations across the Pacific, messages written in code. And their job? Break them. Figure out what the Japanese were saying, where their ships were going, what their generals were planning, when the next attack would come. It sounds simple, but it wasn't. The codes were incredibly complex. The Japanese used multiple encryption systems, military codes, diplomatic codes, naval codes. Some used substitution ciphers, others used transposition, and the most secret messages were encrypted using a machine the Americans called Purple. Purple was the Japanese equivalent of Germany's Enigma machine, a mechanical cipher device that scrambled messages into seemingly random gibberish. To break it, you needed more than intelligence. You needed intuition, pattern recognition, and endless patience. The women of Arlington Hall had all three. Let me tell you what it was like to be a code breaker at Arlington Hall. You'd arrive at your desk at 8 a.m., sometimes earlier. Sometimes you worked the night shift. In front of you would be stacks of paper. Intercepted messages, rows and rows of numbers or Japanese characters, nonsense to the untrained eye. But you knew better. You knew there was a pattern, a structure, a logic buried beneath the chaos. Your job was to find it. Hour after hour, you'd analyze the messages, looking for repeated sequences, counting character frequencies, comparing one message to another. Sometimes you'd work on the same message for weeks, and then, suddenly, something would click. A pattern would emerge, a key phrase would reveal itself, and the code would crack open like a safe. One of the most famous breakthroughs at Arlington Hall came in 1943. A team led by a woman named Genevieve Grotjean was working on a particularly stubborn Japanese diplomatic code. For months, they'd made no progress. The code seemed random, unbreakable. But Grotjean noticed something, a tiny inconsistency, a repeated pattern in the way certain characters appeared. She ran the numbers, tested her theory, and then, after weeks of sleepless nights, she cracked it. The code fell apart, and suddenly, the Americans could read Japan's most secret diplomatic communications, messages between Tokyo and Japanese embassies around the world, messages that revealed Japan's strategy, its alliances, its weaknesses. Grotjean's breakthrough was a turning point in the war, but you'd never know her name, because everything she did was classified, top secret, and she couldn't tell anyone, not her family, not her friends, not even her husband. This was the reality for all the women at Arlington Hall. They were doing some of the most important work of the war. But they couldn't talk about it, not during the war, not after. For decades, they kept the secret. Even when they came home and people asked, "What did you do during the war?" they'd smile and say, "Oh, just clerical work," or "I typed reports," and they'd leave it at that, because they'd signed an oath of secrecy, punishable by imprisonment if broken, so they stayed silent. But the work they did was anything but silent. By 1943, Arlington Hall was a code-breaking machine. Over 7,000 people worked there, most of them women. They worked in shifts around the clock, breaking codes, translating messages, analyzing intelligence, and sending it up the chain to military commanders in the Pacific. One of the most critical codes they broke was called the Water Transport Code. It was used by the Japanese military to coordinate troop and supply movements across the Pacific. Breaking it allowed the Americans to track Japanese convoys, to know when and where they were sailing, and to sink them. By late 1944, American submarines were devastating Japanese supply lines. Ships carrying food, fuel, ammunition, and troops were being sunk at an alarming rate. Japan's ability to resupply its forces was collapsing, and a huge part of that success was due to the women at Arlington Hall. They'd given the US Navy a map, a real-time picture of Japanese movements, and the Navy used it to lethal effect. Admiral Chester Nimitz later said that intelligence won the Pacific War, and much of that intelligence came from Arlington Hall. But again, the women who produced it were invisible. Their names weren't in the newspapers. They didn't get medals, they didn't get parades, they just went back to work, day after day, message after message, code after code, and they did it with extraordinary skill. One woman, Anne Cara Christie, became one of the foremost experts on Japanese military codes. She could look at a message and within minutes identify which code system was being used. She had an almost supernatural ability to see patterns, to sense structure where others saw only chaos. After the war, Cara Christie stayed with the agency that would eventually become the NSA. She rose through the ranks, and in 1980, she became the deputy director of the National Security Agency, the first woman ever to hold that position. But in 1942, she was just a 23-year-old schoolteacher from New York, sitting at a desk in Arlington Hall, breaking codes, saving lives, winning the war. Another woman, Wilma Berryman, worked on breaking Japanese army codes. She later recalled the immense pressure. Every message we broke could mean the difference between life and death for American soldiers. We knew that, and we felt the weight of it every single day. They weren't just breaking codes, they were protecting their brothers, husbands, and friends who were fighting in the Pacific. Every decrypted message could prevent an ambush, could save a convoy, could give American forces the advantage they needed to win a battle, and the women knew it. So they worked harder. They skipped meals. They worked through the night. They pushed their minds to the breaking point, because they knew what was at stake, and they refused to fail.
But this kind of work took a toll. Mental exhaustion was common. The women worked long hours in windowless rooms, staring at endless rows of numbers and letters, searching for patterns that might not even exist. It was isolating, frustrating, and mentally draining. Some women broke down. They'd cry at their desks, or they'd stare blankly at a message, unable to focus. The stress was immense, and there was no one they could talk to about it. They couldn't vent to a friend, couldn't write about it in a letter home, couldn't even tell their roommates what they were working on. They had to carry it alone. One woman, Dot Braden, later said, "There were days I wanted to quit, days I thought I couldn't do it anymore. But then I'd think about the boys overseas, and I'd get back to work." Another woman, Elizabeth Friedman, who worked in a related intelligence unit, once wrote, "The weight of secrets is heavier than any physical burden. It never leaves you, and for some, it didn't." Even after the war ended, many of the women struggled. They'd spent years living a double life, pretending they were just secretaries or clerks, when in reality they were some of the most brilliant minds in the country. And when the war ended, they were told to go home, to forget what they'd done, to never speak of it again. Some tried to go back to their old lives, back to teaching, back to being housewives, but it wasn't the same. They'd changed. They'd seen what they were capable of. They'd done work that mattered, work that saved lives, work that changed history, and now they were expected to just forget. One woman, interviewed decades later, said, "I felt like I'd been erased, like the most important thing I'd ever done never happened." But it did happen, and slowly, over the years, the truth began to come out. In the 1970s, some of the wartime secrecy began to lift. Documents were declassified, books were written, and the women of Arlington Hall finally began to get recognition. But by then, many of them were elderly. Some had already passed away, and the world had largely moved on. Still, for those who lived to see it, the recognition mattered. In 2016, the women codebreakers of World War II were honored with a memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. Their names were read aloud, their contributions acknowledged, and finally, after 70 years, they were seen. One of the survivors, now in her 90s, said, "I never needed a parade. I just wanted people to know we were there, that we did something, and they did. They did something extraordinary." So what exactly did the women of Arlington Hall accomplish? Let me put it simply, they helped win the Pacific War. By breaking Japanese codes, they gave American military commanders a critical advantage. They allowed the US to anticipate Japanese movements, to intercept supply convoys, to avoid ambushes, to launch surprise attacks. One of the most significant intelligence coups came in April 1943. The codebreakers at Arlington Hall intercepted and decrypted a message detailing the travel plans of Admiral Yamamoto. Yamamoto was the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was Japan's most brilliant naval strategist, and he was flying to the Solomon Islands to inspect troops. The message gave his exact flight path, the time of departure, the time of arrival, everything. The intelligence was passed to military commanders, and they made a decision. Yamamoto would be assassinated. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted Yamamoto's plane. They shot it down. Yamamoto was killed. Japan lost its greatest military mind, and American morale soared. That mission was made possible by the codebreakers, by the women sitting at desks in Arlington Hall, quietly breaking codes, quietly changing history. Another major success came with the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. American intelligence, much of it derived from decrypted Japanese messages, allowed the US Navy to anticipate a massive Japanese carrier attack. The Americans were ready. They launched preemptive strikes, and in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American pilots shot down over 600 Japanese aircraft in 2 days. Japan's naval air power was effectively destroyed. And again, the codebreakers had provided the intelligence that made it possible. By 1945, the Japanese military was in chaos. Their communications were compromised, their supply lines were severed, their strategic plans were known to the Americans before they could even be executed. And much of that was due to the work done at Arlington Hall. The women who worked there didn't fire a single shot, but they may have saved hundreds of thousands of lives by shortening the war, by preventing ambushes, by giving American forces the information they needed to win. Admiral Nimitz once said, "The war in the Pacific was won by intelligence." And he was right. But what he didn't say, what he couldn't say at the time, was that much of that intelligence came from women. Women who had been teachers and secretaries and students just a few years earlier. Women who had taught themselves cryptography, who had mastered Japanese, who had worked tirelessly, selflessly, and in complete secrecy. They were the invisible army, the silent warriors, and they were essential. When the war ended in August 1945, the women of Arlington Hall were told to pack up, to go home, and to never speak of what they'd done. Most of them complied. They returned to their hometowns. Some got married, some went back to teaching, others took jobs as secretaries or clerks. And for decades they kept the secret, even as historians wrote books about World War II, even as documentaries were made, even as the men who fought were celebrated as heroes. The women said nothing because they'd been ordered not to, and because for many of them no one asked. Society in the 1950s and 60s didn't expect much from women. They were supposed to be wives and mothers, not codebreakers, not strategists, not intellectuals. So the women of Arlington Hall faded into the background, their stories untold, their contributions forgotten. It wasn't until the 1990s and 2000s that their work finally began to be recognized. Journalists started tracking them down, interviewing them, telling their stories, and slowly the world began to understand. In 2014, a documentary called Code Girls brought renewed attention to their work. Books were written, memorials were erected, and finally, the women who had been silent for so long were able to speak. One woman, interviewed in her 80s, was asked how it felt to finally be recognized. She paused, and then she said, "It feels like I can finally tell the truth." Another said, "I'm just glad people know now that we weren't just typists. We were part of the war effort. We mattered, and they did. They mattered more than most people will ever know." Today, Arlington Hall still stands. It's no longer a secret facility. It's now part of a defense installation. But if you walk the grounds, you can still feel the history. You can imagine the rows of desks, the women hunched over encrypted messages, the quiet determination, the brilliance, the sacrifice. These women didn't ask for recognition. They didn't demand glory. They just did the work. Because their country needed them, and because they knew it mattered, they helped win the war. They saved lives, they changed history, and they did it all in silence. For over 50 years, their story was classified, erased, forgotten, but not anymore. Today, we remember, we honor, and we say thank you to the women of Arlington Hall, The silent warriors, the codebreakers who helped win World War II. Their legacy is not written in headlines, it's written in the lives they saved, in the battles they helped win, and in the example they set. That intelligence, determination, and courage come in many forms, and sometimes the most powerful weapon in war is the human mind. This was the story of the women codebreakers of Arlington Hall, the women who broke the codes and broke the silence.